Dr. Piraye Beim, welcome to the Wellness Roundtable.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So I have to just quickly tell the story of how our paths crossed. It was actually at Masters of Scale last October in San Francisco. And there were all of these special lunch tables with different world-renowned experts. And you were leading a lunch table on women's health, which I went to. And right before we were about to kick off, you got a notification that Celmatix, the company that you founded, received a really significant grant from ARPA-H. And it was incredibly special to be there with you when you got that news.
I remember that was a pretty magical day.
None of us knew each other, but
Yeah.
It was just like being part of history with your company. It was very cool.
And what I'll say is that I asked for pitches for those lunch roundtables, and I proposed the women's health, menopause, perimenopause. And at first, there was no one at the table, and I thought, oh no, this was a bad idea to propose this particular topic. But as you saw, people started filtering in.
It was standing room only.
Standing room only, and men showed up too, which was great.
It was amazing. So as you know, this podcast is about longevity. And in this episode, we're focusing on women's health and really trying to answer the question of why women have a longer lifespan than men, but they have a significantly shorter health span. So let's start at 30,000 feet. Why is ovarian aging such a pivotal yet under-discussed driver of reduced health span in women?
I'm really glad that you started with the statistics on women's longevity, their lifespan versus their wealth span. I think that there's a big misconception because I think it's generally understood that women outlive men, that means that women somehow are healthier. And what's been really important is for people to understand that we pay a big price for those extra years of life that we have. McKinsey just released a report last year estimating that women are sick for 25% more of their life than men. So as you said, women have a much shorter wealth span, that after a certain point, men and women just don't age equitably. So this has long been a conundrum in the field. Why is that? And I think that for a long time, there was this perception that, well, women are sicker because they live longer. So they're in those advanced years for longer. But the thinking has really changed over the last few years. In part, the work that I've been doing has been very influential in changing how people perceive the problem here, which is that the fundamental difference between how women age and how men age is that men age with a fully functioning gonad and women do not. So this is where we get into the idea of ovarian health and that the ovaries should be healthy. I think when most people think of ovaries, they think babies. And when most people think about menopause, which is when the ovary stops working, they think about hot flashes. But the ovary is important for much more than just making babies. And menopause is about a lot more than hot flashes. In fact, ovarian function is really key, and we consider it central command of the body. And there are significant lasting health consequences to having the ovary not function well early in life because of conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, early menopause, which collectively impact over 30% of women. So some women never have a fully well-functioning ovary. And all women who live past the age of 50 will have ovarian failure, and the organ will actually stop working. So they will not have a functioning gonad. And what we're now understanding is that the end of ovarian function in that perimenopause, menopause transition is the single biggest accelerant of unhealthy aging. You look at the statistics and they're stark of what a woman's life is like before her gonad stops working and after. And so that's been something that I've been trying to raise awareness about.
So how does the menopause transition act as an inflection point for female aging? How does it impact chronic disease onset from cardiovascular to Alzheimer's?
Great question. So the way that the ovary impacts the onset of chronic disease and unhealthy aging, including things like Alzheimer's, is that the ovary is a reproductive organ in the sense that we do have our oocytes, our eggs, developing in the ovary, but the ovary does a lot more than just reproduction. So the ovary is involved in metabolism, which is a way of saying how we process food, how we handle sugar, alcohol, things like that in our bodies. The ovary is involved in immune function. And so in particular, it impacts inflammation and how, because of the ovary, women's inflammaging is different than for men. It impacts the endocrine system. People are aware of hormones like estrogen and progesterone. Increasingly, they're becoming aware that testosterone is also a key ovarian hormone.
Mm.
They're gonadal hormones. So men produce estrogen, we produce testosterone. These are things that gonads make, irrespective of whether it's a male or a female gonad. So people have heard of that. But a few things that people don't realize is that when we think about endocrine function, it's not just estrogen and progesterone, which are the hormones that are added back in HRT, hormone replacement therapy.
Mm-hmm.
HRT is really the tip of the iceberg. The ovary is important for thyroid function. It's important for insulin signaling. So many other hormonal pathways intersect. So overall endocrine function is really impacted by the ovary. And so when the ovary doesn't function correctly, organs get starved for glucose because insulin signaling and glucose signaling is not happening correctly. This can impact the brain. This can help explain why we have brain fog during menopause, why there's shrinkage of the brain that can be a precursor to things like Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
When the immune piece of this is misregulated, that can impact inflammation. Chronic unmitigated inflammation is a big underlier for cancer risk. It's an underlier for heart disease, for mental health issues early in life and Alzheimer's later in life. The other thing that the ovary does that people don't think about is really impacts sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So we hear now increasingly women are becoming aware that some of the sleep disturbances that they start to experience in midlife are attributed to perimenopause and menopause, but they don't necessarily understand that is actually rooted in their ovarian biology dysfunctioning. You need melatonin to make ovarian hormones. And then ovarian hormones in turn signal back to the brain to regulate melatonin. All of this is impacted by cortisol, which is our stress hormone. So there's a lot to dissect here, but the bottom line is there's a lot going on at the ovary. And as those unique and distinct functions of the ovary start to go offline, and each of those functions go offline at a different rate and at a different time, which is why each woman has a uniquely different experience of perimenopause, which is the
Mm-hmm.
process of basically this gonad, this key and vital organ not functioning anymore. It doesn't just happen overnight unless you are a cancer survivor and have your organ removed, in which case women fall off the cliff of all of these functions overnight and really struggle. But for most women, it's a 10-year-long process where some women might be impacted by the sleep aspects or the inflammatory aspects or the weight gain, the metabolic issues, the mental health at different points in time.
Mm-hmm.
But universally, pretty much everyone will be impacted by this. And then the last thing I'll say is that a lot of women say, oh, I don't have any menopausal symptoms. But what they mean is I'm not getting hot flashes. But when you actually start to scratch below the surface, they're having joint pain, they're having sleep disturbances, they're having early signs of osteoporosis. They don't recover from fitness activities like they used to. Their sex drive has changed. Their hair quality has changed. And they don't realize, oh, that's because my gonad is not functioning anymore.
It's so fascinating. And men, I guess, go through andropause, but it's a much more gradual decline. Is that
It's a
right?
gradual decline, and it also is pushed out significantly. So
Yeah.
for us, we start to experience all of these things in our 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that not only are we going to live past our gonadal function, but we're going to live past it for decades. Andropause, as you called it, which is an emerging area of understanding of what happens when the testes stop functioning, that happens on average in the mid 90s. Most men are not living long enough to experience it, which actually I'd like to sidebar on that point and talk about menopause, which is that 100 years ago, the average life expectancy for a woman in the West was early 40s.
Mm-hmm.
And since the ovary stops working on average in the early 50s, most women died with a functioning gonad. So demographically speaking, menopause is a relatively modern phenomenon. And if we're able to extend human longevity well past 100, andropause for men is going to start to become a real issue. And we're going to start to learn what it means for men to suddenly en masse not have decades of their life with their testicular function. But the other key difference, as you mentioned, is that for women, our ovarian function declines linearly over time, so slowly. But then in our 30s, because of the nature of the biology of the ovary, it starts to decline more than linearly. So not quite exponentially, but we basically fall off a cliff. It is actually shaped like a cliff. So that's not just a phrase. It is actually a shape of the curve. And so our ovarian function declines very rapidly in our 30s and early 40s, whereas for men, it declines really slow and steadily. So their bodies do have time to adjust, even though men are also impacted by declining hormonal function and testicular function. And if you, for example, take prostate cancer survivors who have had to undergo what for men we call castration, we don't use that word with women, even though it should be the same word, it's the same concept. We have ectomy, we have like kind of softer words when ovaries are removed, but it is castration, it is removal of a gonad. So when men have to undergo castration, they also see increased risk for things like Alzheimer's and all of these other metabolic and other issues. So really, it's not menopause, it is the end of gonadal function. And so that's why I try to take the gender pronouns out of gonads occasionally, because I've had people say, oh, women have gonads? Like, of course we do. Like, how would we be here without our gonads?
It's fascinating. It's like you have to back up all the way to sex ed in middle school. So I think it's a perfect segue to turn and talk about Celmatix, the company you founded in 2009 and what its goals are. I'd love for you to talk about what Celmatix is all about and what you're trying to accomplish.
So I'm very proud of Celmatix. We're now called Celmatix Therapeutics. We've been around in May for 16 years, believe it or not. It's been quite a journey. So taking a step back, I've been innovating in women's health as a scientist and researcher for over 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And started off in academia, like a lot of scientists, did my PhD and then my postdoctoral work in this field, but then saw an opportunity to really impact standard of care in a faster way. When you're in academia, you publish papers, you present at medical conferences, scientific conferences, but for me, it didn't feel satisfying that we kept publishing paper after paper, but it wasn't actually changing how anyone was treated. It wasn't changing the information that everyday women had.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I really craved that interface of really translating this work we were doing on the bench to something that somebody could actually be impacted by. And so entrepreneurship is really where I found my home. And I founded Celmatix in 2009 with a pretty simple thesis, which was women have unique body parts. We have unique chromosomal differences. So our DNA is actually different on a cellular level. But even though we know that we have different body parts and that we have distinct biology on a macro level, on a micro level, we just really didn't understand what does it mean on a cellular and molecular level to be a female cell? What are the molecules actually involved in conditions that only impact women's bodies? Mm-hmm. And that seems really simple, right? Like, what does it mean to be a female cell? And yet it is one of the biggest mysteries still in science because we've invested such little resources into actually trying to study this. So less than 9% of all of biomedical research funding by the US government goes into women's health. Less than 2% of all VC funding goes into women's health broadly as a category. But when we go into the kind of deep tech that we're doing, it's less than 1%. And when we look at big pharma, even though the majority of their profits are from drugs that are either uniquely or disproportionately taken by women, they reinvest less than 1% of those profits into innovation in this space. So it's really underserved and overlooked. And so when I started the company and said, hey, let's really try to understand this on a data level first and foremost, and then let's build purpose-built products that are uniquely made for female biology on top of those insights, I didn't realize how radical it was to propose that back in 2009.
Wow. And so what interventions look the most promising, from pharmaceuticals to diagnostics? One thing that you said at Masters of Scale that blew my mind was you said there hasn't been a blockbuster female therapeutic since the birth control pill was introduced.
Well, so it's a little, let me refine that a little bit. So there are a number of blockbuster women's health drugs. They were not purpose built for women. So these are drugs that were repurposed from cancer or from chronic cough or something like that. Blockbuster just means sales.
Mm-hmm.
So pharma is raking in profits. So they have plenty of blockbusters. In fact, 40% of all their blockbuster drugs are drugs that uniquely are taken by women. The problem is that women are getting marginal benefit from these drugs because they weren't really purpose built for them. They were brought into women's health to say, well, we already have these drugs. Let's see if they work for these conditions. Mm-hmm. And so the nuance that I mentioned at Masters of Scale is we haven't had a purpose-built drug where we said, let's start with something we know uniquely impacts women and is uniquely a piece of knowledge we have about their body, and let's build a drug from scratch just for their bodies. The last time we built a drug from scratch for a woman's body was the birth control pill.
Wow.
Which was the 1950s.
Wow.
Yeah, it's staggering, right? It like predates the venture capital industry. Venture capital started in the 1980s. So in the entire history of venture capital, we don't have a single drug that was built from scratch for a condition that uniquely impacts women.
And so Celmatix, is your goal to slow ovarian aging? Is that the thesis that has emerged?
So a couple of different theses have emerged. Yes, we do have a drug program that I'm happy to share more about that is aimed at slowing ovarian aging. And as you mentioned, we got that incredible ARPA-H award, and you were there for that exciting moment when I was taking it all in and thinking about what the implications were in a wonderful way. But there are three key pillars that underlie our drug programs at Celmatix. And this work has come out of all of that data gathering and knowledge building that we did over a decade. And our drug development program has been up and running for about 6 years. So first 10 years of the company is really trying to understand, what are we dealing with here? What is the biology? Where are those points of leverage in the human body where we can impact female biology instead of just trying to shut it down? If you think about it, women lose their body parts progressively over their lifespan. Often their breasts are removed, their ovaries, their fallopian tubes, they undergo hysterectomies, they lose their uteruses. We're taking that female biology away from them, or they're put on immunosuppressive drugs where they just suppress their entire immune system because we can't handle how their unique female biology is impacting them and leading to things like autoimmune disorders. We turn their estrogen signaling off with things like GnRH antagonists, Lupron, or we just try to turn the lights up really bright and add all this estrogen and progesterone back into their bodies as this kind of like foghorn of hormonal signal. We have no nuanced way of actually working with female biology. So I would say that from a biological perspective, the two biggest insights that came out of $100 million of investment into the data piece of this was, one, that the ovary is not just reproductive and it's involved in so much. And we really do have to ensure that it functions well throughout a woman's lifespan. That means no more menopause. So that was one. And then the second big theme that came out was the role of inflammation. But what I would say is that the three key pillars that are missing for modern women, so these are women who are expected to live well into their 80s, for them to really not just survive into their 80s, but thrive disease-free into their 80s. One is that all of a woman's organs, including her ovaries, should function well throughout her lifespan. And so we are focused on ovarian aging because that is the only organ that we just let stop working.
Mm-hmm.
Only one. Find me another organ, maybe the appendix, which,
Right.
arguable if it's even an organ. But what other organ did we just say, oh, you went blind, or oh, you can't hear anymore, or oh, your kidneys aren't functioning, or your thyroid's not functioning? There's not a single organ that we just say, it's just natural, it stopped working. And yet we've created this exceptionalism. We've built all these stories, and we're being asked now to feel empowered by and celebrate the end of the function of this organ. And I do not accept that. As a woman, I don't accept that as a biologist. And so, yes, ovarian aging, very big pillar. We have to tackle that. The second pillar is for women who are thriving well into their 80s, they need better fertility care.
Mm-hmm.
So we need care that is less invasive, that doesn't rely as heavily on IVF, which is expensive and very difficult to go through for many women. So we want solutions that make the process of going through IVF easier, and we want to reduce our reliance on IVF and move more fertility tools into the hands of OBGYNs so that women can get care and can conceive more naturally, and also can conceive healthy pregnancies later in their life. So we've got two groundbreaking fertility drugs that we're working on for the second pillar. And then the third is that we need disease modifying true treatments for conditions that uniquely impact women's bodies. So these are things like endometriosis and PCOS. And so we have a groundbreaking J&K inhibitor program that we announced a few months ago to allow the body to heal itself. It's an immunotherapy for endometriosis that also has applications in PCOS and ovarian aging.
That's incredible. Wow. If we can touch on the ovarian health piece further, is part of it to look at the biomarkers of ovarian reserve and diagnose that? Are we getting close to having a biological ovarian age that we can track alongside muscle mass and other things? And is that relevant, or do you go straight to a therapeutic?
So I'll answer that in two parts. So one, I'll tell you about the biomarkers we have and our ability to track ovarian function over time. And then I'll tell you therapeutically what makes the most sense. So on the biomarker piece, we have excellent biomarkers. So we don't need really that much further innovation on this. So anti-mullerian hormone is a biomarker that can be assessed with a simple finger prick. and is a very reliable marker of where you are in your ovarian lifespan. As you start to get closer to menopause, additional biomarkers kick in, like you can do an ultrasound measurement of how many visible follicles there are that are in late stage follicle development in the ovary. That gives you a sense of how many there are left in the reserve. And you can look at other hormones like follicle stimulating hormones. So from a biomarker standpoint, it's very straightforward for a doctor to be able to look at those biomarkers and say where you are on your ovarian aging timeline. There's been some controversy about AMH being used as a fertility biomarker, which is different.
That's anti-Mullerian hormone.
Anti-Mullerian hormone. So when anti-Mullerian hormone testing came out, it was billed as a fertility test. And we were a little concerned as the folks who were on the forefront had the world's largest AMH data set from women that it was being used and billed as a fertility test because it's a very good marker of ovarian reserve, and it's a very good marker of how you will respond to fertility drugs.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a very good marker of your fertility until the very end. Like when it is very, very low, then it is a marker of fertility. But right until maybe the last few years of your fertility span, it's not a very good marker of fertility because women can have a lot of success with spontaneous pregnancies and have no fertility issues with relatively low AMH levels as long as there's a functional amount of AMH. AMH is relative for everyone. So AMH is the molecular brake that keeps the ovary from running out of follicles and eggs too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're born with a lower ovarian reserve, you need less AMH to naturally maintain the brakes. So imagine a car, like if a car is going really fast, you have to press on the brakes really hard. If a car is not going that fast, you don't have to press on the brakes. So when AMH testing first came out, they thought that because women, as their ovarian reserve goes down, their AMH levels go down, they'd be counseling women who naturally have a smaller reserve that based on their AMH levels, oh, you have the ovaries of a 40-year-old. I got told that when I was 30. It was devastating to hear at 30 that I had the ovaries of a 40-year-old. I went on to have 3 healthy, beautiful children through just intercourse and natural methods at home. I never needed any fertility interventions, but I had to go through about a year of counseling because I was told that I had 40-year-old ovaries that were never going to work. They were right that my ovaries would not have been very productive for fertility treatment, using oocytes, but they were wrong that I would have issues getting pregnant at home. So that biomarker is a complicated biomarker. Having said that, I am somebody who's experiencing perimenopause and overall decline in my fertility a little earlier than the natural curve. I did have a lower ovarian reserve in part because I have endometriosis. So that's like a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down. But to answer your question about the therapeutic piece, the process of ovarian follicle growth and development, which is called folliculogenesis. So when you think about hair, it grows in a hair follicle. I think people understand there are cells that grow the hair. And as that follicle becomes unhealthy, the hair loses its pigmentation, it loses its quality, it can fall out. It's the same thing with an ovarian follicle. So we have follicles, which are support cells that grow an egg. And as that follicle becomes less healthy, then you have poor quality oocytes. The oocytes also have their own internal aging clock. That is a measure of DNA damage that we accumulate over time. But follicles are the functional unit of the ovary, and they don't just grow an egg, but they also do all of the crosstalk I was saying with the body around helping maintain immune function, metabolic function, endocrine function, et cetera. So that process is very wasteful. We have a lot more of those follicles. We're born with a finite number of those potential follicles, so the cells that can turn into those follicles at birth. And that's called our ovarian reserve. It's like a bank account, and you basically start to spend it, and it gets really from the time that your ovary develops in utero, you start to lose follicles. And so women are born with a different number of those at birth. They go through their bank account at a different rate. That's based on their genetics. It's also based on environmental factors. And so what we want to do in theory, if we really want to extend ovarian function throughout the lifespan, is we want to put the brakes on the waste that happens because there's a lot of follicles that get wasted. We want to put the brakes on that process as early as possible. So in the future, when our drug is in the market, what we predict is that women will, like birth control, start on this drug in adolescence, and it will help them regulate their ovarian function throughout their lifespan. They would need to come off of this drug when they want to get pregnant because what it will do is it will tune the ovary for longevity, not for fertility optimization. So they will be subfertile or it will have a full contraceptive effect while they're on it. but they would want to come off of it for probably about a year before they want to get pregnant, because it takes about 300 days to make a follicle. So if you really want all those follicles competing to be the perfect egg, which is what's happening and why it's such a wasteful process, you want to re-trigger that process when you want to have a baby. But other than that, most women don't need the perfect egg every single month, but they do need a wonderfully functioning ovary every single month.
That's incredible. What's the timeline for something like this?
Based on our estimates of how long it's going to take to develop this, and this assumes we can continue to raise funding for it, because it is really an uphill battle to get these things funded. If we can keep funding on track, then I think that any woman who today is under the age of 32 will likely have a choice of whether she goes into menopause or not.
Wow. And if we can extend ovarian function, what are, in your mind, the ripple effects, not just on fertility, but then what does healthspan look like? Autonomy, equity. Yeah, there's so many ripple effects.
So many ripple effects. So this is not just a biomedical topic. This is a societal and ethical, economists need to know this is coming. This is going to be one of the biggest waves that sweeps across our species ever. It's going to be bigger than the birth control pill. I mean, the birth control pill, you think of all of the knock-on first order, second order, third order effects of having access to the ability to time pregnancy and the impact that has had on human civilization. I mean, where do I start? First of all, women drive 80% of healthcare decisions. We are 80% of healthcare providers inside and outside of the home. And right now, as we talked about, we are not healthy. And so having the health giving demographic within our species thriving and healthier themselves is going to have that second order effect of we can help take care of others better if our own bodies are not falling apart. So I think that's really important. When we look at, for example, care homes, the majority of people in nursing homes are women. And if you talk to people who run those nursing homes, they say it's not just because they're older, they're aging disproportionately. And it's things like urinary incontinence that, ends up resulting in women, because if you can't control when you pee, and if your pelvic floor is trash, which again is a significant risk factor and consequence of menopause and the end of gonadal function, you can't just be out in the world living your normal life like you did before. And imagine a world in which women are not disproportionately experiencing urinary incontinence. They are not the majority right now. 2 out of every 3 people who has dementia is female. And so when you think about those dementia care homes, they're full of women. And imagine now they're not. And those women are out helping care for their families, engaging in activities, contributing to the economy. So we're talking about taking the healthcare burden off of the economy. Last year in the US alone, women, mostly between the ages of 18 to 44, spent $8.8 billion more on pharmaceuticals than men just last year. So imagine if we take the burden on our economy of having to medicate women so heavily off, but then we activate the positive economic aspect of that, which is now these women are thriving and contributing to the system. They're not needing days off of work. They are not retiring early. They aren't having all of those issues. They can travel. They can have hobbies. So we talk about men age like a fine wine. Well, imagine all the knock-on effects if women age like a fine wine.
I'm in the middle of it now. And if I had a choice, I would definitely choose to not go through this. And I think there's a lot of lifestyle interventions, but there's just certain things where you feel like the decline is happening in terms of bone mineral density and estrogen, and all of that cocktail of hormones that you were describing is what keeps the body and the mind sort of humming, right?
And it's a dynamic process. We talked about this at the Masters of Scale meeting, that estrogen is a misnomer. There are estrogens. There are at least 6 of them and counting, because again, we understudy this stuff. And they are not static. So we don't just have estrogen in our body. It fluctuates. And when you say, oh, well, you just put a woman on HRT, and then what's the point of saving her ovary? Well, HRT does not recapitulate the beautiful dynamic symphony of the rising and falling of not just estrogen, but estrogens in response to an infection, in response to your sleep, your environment. It is a very dynamic process, one that we barely have a handle on. And we are not even closely approximating. I know that women have relief from being on estrogen therapy for a number of things, but it doesn't fix everything. And so you just are not going to be able to ever pharmacologically or from a lifestyle standpoint recapitulate the loss of this vital organ. You just can't. And so that's why I've dedicated so much of my career to actually saving the organ and getting the organ itself to survive and function well.
I love that. And I think so many women are just used to feeling a little crappier every year
Yeah.
and told that that's normal, just
Yeah.
like a little worse every year.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be.
How do you respond to the critiques? And it's hard to imagine who these come from, but they are out there, that efforts to delay menopause are playing into anti-aging or pronatalist pressures on women.
Yes. So anything to do with women's bodies is so fraught, right? So where do we begin on that? A couple of points that I feel particularly sensitized and sensitive to. One is that women fear, and people fear generally, they equate estrogen and ovarian function after a certain age with breast cancer. And so they say, okay, well, you're going to, for this whole generation who isn't going to get to benefit from menopause because you're going to take it away from them, they're all going to get breast cancer. So what I say to that is, first of all, estrogen doesn't cause breast cancer. There's some data that if cancer arises in the body, it can help feed that cancer. And there are women who are impacted by estrogen positive cancers. And what I will say is that without minimizing the experience of those women, the breast is a less vital organ than the ovary. And especially hormone responsive, estrogen responsive breast cancer is very treatable. So that's one thing that I just want to remind people. What is not treatable is Alzheimer's. What is not treatable is heart failure and certain types of heart disease and stroke. Those things are treatable, but very life-threatening. The number one killer of women is not breast cancer. It's heart attack and heart disease.
Right.
And so it's not that I don't want women to have healthy breasts. It's that if we're going to put our risk in one bucket, I would much prefer to put my risk in the breast cancer bucket than in the ovarian aging bucket. So that's one. Having said that, that's if you agree with the fear that having ovarian function extend later would cause breast cancer or would contribute to breast cancer. Even if we say, okay, let's say that's true, I still think women should be given the choice of where they want to put their risk. It sucks that they have to do that, by the way. We should have better breast cancer treatments as well. And these things have to track together, right? It shouldn't be an either or, choose your breast or everything else.
Right.
So that's that piece. But I want to tackle that assumption as well that, oh, we're going to cause breast cancer. First of all, even if we are concerned about exposure to estrogen as women age, what we are not clear on for those estrogen sensitive cancers, is it the amount of time we're exposed to estrogen or the total amount of estrogen we're exposed to in our lifespan? And what a lot of women don't realize is we are exposed to a lot more estrogen now than ever in human history. So one is certainly that we're living longer. So we have more tissue around longer to be exposed to estrogen for longer. The second is that we are exposed to a lot of estrogen mimicking compounds in our environment. So we're putting estrogens on our body. We're drinking estrogens in our water. It's all around us, right? So that's a piece. Let's tackle all the environmental endocrine disruptors that we're exposing ourselves to. That is something we should tackle, not let the ovary stop working, right? We shouldn't say, well, because we're not going to tackle all the estrogens in our environment, let's have this vital organ not work. So there's that piece. And then the other thing is that we used to have many more pregnancies and longer periods of breastfeeding. And while estrogen goes up during pregnancy, it's a different kind of estrogen that dominates during pregnancy than estradiol, which is a kind of estrogen that we're exposed to when we're not pregnant. So again, this kind of symphony of estrogens changes when we're pregnant. And then also postpartum, when we're breastfeeding, overall estrogen signaling is suppressed. And so women used to have these periods of suppressed estrogen together with these varieties of estrogen flowing through their body. And we don't do that anymore. We have fewer pregnancies later in our life. And so as we have more and more periods, that means we're being exposed to high estrogen and estradiol for a very long time. Controlling your ovarian function the way that we're proposing through putting the brakes on with AMH, that in theory will give us a more kind of estrogen suppressed, not to a minimal place where we're suffering from it, but to an optimized place where we're not having over estrogen which is something that we consistently have right now. A lot of women have PMS, they have mood swings. In the early half of a woman's cycle, like the first half, women typically feel awesome. And
Yep.
one of the reasons is that they're in that kind of hormonally optimized zone. And then as they ovulate and then move closer to either pregnancy or a period, one or the other, their hormones start to fluctuate in a way that makes them not feel awesome typically. So we can optimize the ovary to stay in that really hormonally optimized zone for longer. So we may actually bring breast cancer rates down. There could be a win-win here. Again, all of this is pure conjecture because we haven't proven it yet. But people are using a theory to say having estrogen around for longer is going to give people cancer, to actually say we shouldn't even do it at all. What I would say is, okay, well, I can hypothesize a counterexample where maybe by actually bringing estrogen signaling more into balance for longer, we might actually bring breast cancer rates down. The other big argument we get is women's bodies are over-medicated. Here you go again, medical industrial complex. Instead of just letting women be women and be in harmony with nature and have these natural bodies, why are we always rushing to pathologize a woman's body and medicate a woman's body? And I hear you loud and clear. I am the number one person who loves to choose a natural method over pharmacological intervention, in part because I know those drugs were not made for my body. And this is a different drug. This is a drug that we are literally making from scratch to try to help women be as healthy as they can throughout their lifespan. You cannot equate a drug that you build from scratch, having spent a decade really understanding what a woman's body needs to function well throughout her lifespan. Remember, living into your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there's nothing natural about that.
Right.
So
Right.
when you do something unnatural, we have to do something also, let's call it unnatural, to make sure that's done in the best possible way. And what we think is we could take this one drug that is purpose-built for women, and taking that one drug and keeping that woman's body healthy through healthy gonadal function will negate the dozen other drugs she's going to end up being put on later to manage diabetes, her obesity, her heart disease, her mental health issues, her osteoporosis. Like, you think of the panoply of drugs that women end up being put on, and women are like, well, I want to be natural. Okay, but you will eventually have to be on a thyroid drug and an osteoporosis drug and an everything drug. I would rather just take that one drug that was purpose-built for my body and put off or eliminate the need for all those other drugs that weren't purpose-built for my body.
I want to sign up for the very first clinical trial. I'm probably too old, but sign me up. In the meantime, are there meaningful lifestyle modifications that you think women can make to help with ovarian function?
Yes, for sure. This is not something that we just have to sit back as passive riders on this bus and say, well, there's no drug for me. The reality is that we can do things, again, with lifestyle, because those are the only tools we have right now, to really try to at least maximize the reserve we were born with and the genetics that we have. That's really basically all you can do, is get the full horsepower for your ovary. We know that women in different parts of the world who have different environmental exposures either go into menopause, like all of them statistically go into menopause a few years earlier or a few years later. And so we know that where you live impacts your age of menopause by a few months to a few years. We also know that there are risk factors that can significantly shorten your ovarian lifespan. So this is things like smoking. So, for example, if you are someone who has difficulty repairing your DNA damage, so somebody with, for example, a BRCA marker, BRCA1 or BRCA2, and you smoke, you statistically will have 3 to 4 years fewer ovarian function than the average woman. So there are things you can do to take years off of your ovarian lifespan and plunge yourself into perimenopause much earlier. On a positive note, the things to do are, one, avoid air pollution to the extent that you can. So I keep very high quality air purifiers in my house. I try to get out of the city and get into fresh air as much as I can, and avoid the air pollution you choose. So things like smoking and secondhand smoke. So you really want to control exposure to smoke. Your ovaries are very sensitive to that. The other things that you can do to optimize your ovarian function is the things you would do to optimize any other organ function. You want to exercise, pushing blood through and helping remove toxins from your organ is really important. Oxygenating those tissues, a cardiovascular exercise, and really doing cardio is important. The other thing is that you want to manage inflammation. and the damage that can happen over time with inflammation. So women with endometriosis, which is a chronic inflammatory condition, as they go from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 endometriosis, we see that their ovarian reserve is significantly impacted as well. So a woman with unmitigated stage 4 endometriosis is going to have a much lower ovarian reserve than a woman who doesn't have endometriosis. Whatever you can do from a lifestyle standpoint to control chronic inflammation. So this is diet, this is avoiding fried foods, processed foods, things like that. The other topics that I think people don't think about are getting more fiber in your diet, sleeping well. Again, we talked about melatonin signaling. All you have to do to shut an ovary down functionally in a rodent, in an experimental model, is stick it in all light for 2 weeks or all dark for 2 weeks. That's all it takes. You
Yep.
basically
Wow.
completely shut down ovarian function if you just disrupt light signaling. So we think about women who are on their phone from dawn to dusk, right up until the last minute, putting all that blue light into their eyes. They aren't thinking this light is going straight signaling to my ovaries. So,
Yeah.
so we want to get natural light exposure in the morning, in the afternoon, midday. You have to get outdoors. You have to get that natural light, bright light into your eyes during the day. And then in the evenings and the early mornings, you have to also make sure that you protect the darkness. I sleep with a sleep mask. I really try to get light into my eyes. I try to wear sunglasses less than I used to. And I try to get a little bit more light onto my skin during the day than before I realized the importance of melatonin signaling. The other thing is vitamin D and sunlight is very important for ovarian function. I have an Instagram handle, Boss Ovary, where I try to put these practical tips of what can you do to preserve your ovarian health and try to extend the function that you have. But the reality is, like, you can optimize, you can sleep well, get perfect circadian rhythm, light balance, have a high fiber diet, avoid inflammatory foods, avoid smoke and air pollution. You can do all the right things. And you still can't beat it, right? Like it is going to stop functioning. And so you're really talking about adding a few years to your ovarian function here. You're not talking
Yeah.
about extending its function throughout your lifespan. There's nothing that can accomplish that right now.
Do you recommend that women follow those biomarkers like the AMH and the other ones that you were mentioning? I don't know if that's standard of care now with gynecologists, but do you recommend women start to track those after 40?
I think they should track them before 40. The researchers I know in the space who have daughters have all of their daughters tested for baseline as teenagers. And
Okay.
AMH levels do fluctuate in your 20s. So you don't want to be upset if it goes up and down. And AMH levels are impacted by birth control. If you're on the pill, your AMH levels can look different. So it's a little hard to interpret in your teens and your 20s what it means, but you want to get a baseline. You want to generally understand maybe every 5 years what's going on with your AMH and just make sure that you aren't at risk of going into early menopause. That's really important. A lot of women go into early menopause. I have a friend who went into early menopause in college, and she ended up being medicated for a mental health condition because they thought it was in her head. It was in her ovaries, and it got missed, and she didn't realize until she struggled with infertility in her early 30s that she had actually gotten into menopause a decade earlier, and at that point had all of the cardiovascular issues, the bone health issues, like so many issues that could have been at least ameliorated, not completely fixed, but addressed. So I do think we need to be tracking these markers. We need to start tracking them probably annually, starting in your 30s, and just get a sense of where you are on your timeline.
That's great advice. And to me, what Celmatix is trying to accomplish makes all the sense in the world to massively extend female health span. And I'm curious what the reception has been like from mainstream medical establishment. What do they make of your moonshot vision?
I think they're very excited. I
That's
think
awesome.
there's a growing awareness that menopause is not just about hot flashes. There are so many women who have suffered so much in perimenopause and menopause and are finding their voice and are finding community and celebrating that they can talk about their symptoms and not feel stigmatized. I don't want to take that celebration away. But when I hear people saying we should throw a party to celebrate that we're in menopause, to celebrate that our ovaries stopped working, I cringe a little bit just as a biologist sitting in the audience of those, those events or, seeing things on social media. Yes, we find community when we have breast cancer or we find community when we go through different diseases, but who's being asked to celebrate the fact that they have that disease? I don't think that's fair to ask women to kind of celebrate. And when you look at the comments often when these kind of posts go live, you have so much pain and suffering. Like women are like, why are you asking me to celebrate this? Like, this is like, here are the real consequences on my body. So what I would say is that physicians are feeling overwhelmed. You know, women didn't used to go talk to their doctors about this stuff, but now they're hearing about it and they're showing up. And on one of my Boss Ovary podcasts, I talked to Dr. Heidi Flagg, who is inundated. She has a 2-year wait list for her practice of women who realized, oh, maybe this is perimenopause or maybe this is menopause. I need to go talk to someone. So I think physicians are increasingly understanding how all of this female biology is impacting them, whether they're an autoimmune focused doctor, a rheumatologist, or a cardiologist who's treating women. And so I think physicians are very excited about the prospect of this. It's very early days. I have to just keep restating that. I've said a lot of things. The things I'm saying are my hopes and dreams. These are not data that we have yet. We cannot make these claims yet from a medical standpoint. But every medical breakthrough started with a dream. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to dream and we have to give this a shot. You know, you think about antibiotics and what a game changer that was. We learned some things about antibiotics, which is they can be overused. So as with any medical breakthrough, there's going to be a deeper, more nuanced conversation. But I think that these are tools that have to exist and we have to start progressing these things because the alternative, I think, is just unsustainable. Women are just not okay with how we are aging right now.
Totally. Dr. Beim, I know people are going to listen to this conversation. They're going to want to follow you and follow everything that Celmatix is doing. Where should they go to stay current on this conversation?
I'm a scientist and an entrepreneur, but I have been urged by people in my life to try to keep an Instagram page current with the research that I see out in the field, with what I'm learning, what I'm doing for my own body, how we're doing on developing these things. So my handle is boss_ovary, and they can follow along on Boss Ovary to learn more about our progress.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Wellness Roundtable.
Thank you so much for having me.